Hi everyone, my name is Pat Woodward and I am a professor of chemistry at Ohio State University. This is the first lecture in a new course I'm teaching entitled Diffraction Methods. The focus of this course is the structure and symmetry of crystals and the use of diffraction methods to determine the structures of those crystals. This is a field that might be broadly called crystallography. Now, crystallography is one of the most powerful techniques known to scientists. There have been no fewer than 17 Nobel Prizes given for advances in crystallography, starting in 1914 with Max von Laue, who discovered X-ray diffraction, and coming up to 2011 when Danny Shechtman received the Nobel Prize for his discovery of quasicrystals. And what makes this technique so powerful is that you can take a crystal that you could hold in your hand or pick up with a pair of tweezers. Here we see twinned crystals of the mineral pyrite, or fool's gold. And using the techniques of diffraction, we can get a snapshot at the atomic length scale of how the atoms are arranged in that crystal. So in pyrite, you have iron and sulfur atoms arranged in this sort of pattern. And once we know the pattern of atoms, we can determine the bond lengths. We can determine the bonding. We can determine so many things. We could talk about the double helix of DNA. Once it was understood the structure, the atomic structure from crystallography, then that told you so many things about the biological function of those molecules. So really that's the big picture. But we've got to start at a little bit more basic level. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about the fundamental property of crystals. And that is something called translational symmetry. So if we were to look at two different materials, both of these are solids. Here I'm showing on the left the mineral galena, which is lead sulfide. And on the right, we have obsidian, which is an aluminosilicate with potassium. The galena is a crystalline solid. And we can see that just from a visual inspection of it, that crystals have facets. You know, the crystals have specific shapes. Now, in this particular sample of galena, there are many crystals that are growing into one another. Okay, so it's not a single crystal, but multiple crystals. Whereas the obsidian, which is also sometimes called volcanic glass, you can see that, you know, there aren't well-defined facets to that hunk of obsidian. You would also see this if you take an amorphous solid like window glass, which is maybe the most familiar amorphous solid. If you were to break a piece of glass, you know, the shards of the glass don't all take really regular repeating shapes. And the underlying reason has to do with something called translational symmetry. So if we were to look at the atomic length scale, we could see this more clearly. In galena, we have this regular repeating pattern of lead and sulfur atoms. And if we just take one layer out of galena, which has the same structure as table salt, for those of you looking for a more familiar example, and you can see that the lead and the sulfur atoms make really what is a checkerboard. And there's kind of a square that we can see down here, and that is the repeating unit. So if we just repeat that square over and over again, and it's actually a three-dimensional crystal, so it's a cube. If we repeat that cube over and over again, and the contents of each cube are exactly the same, that would give us a sample of lead sulfide, galena. And so that repeating pattern of atoms, that is the characteristic feature of a crystal, and that's called translational symmetry. Whereas if we were to look at an amorphous solid like glass, here's an image that shows the silicon atoms in black and the oxygen atoms in white. And what you can see is that each silicon is, you know, making bonds to 3 oxygens, and each oxygen is making bonds to 2 silicon atoms. You know, locally, this thing has a kind of repeating unit to it. But if we were to look over a longer range of space, we see that, you know, not all of these rings are the same. Some of them are formed a little differently than others. Here we have a rectangular ring. Here we have a rectangular ring sort of pointing in a different way. Here's something, this ring we don't see anywhere else in this pattern. So locally, each silicon and each oxygen are more or less the same, but there's no repeating pattern. So that is an amorphous solid. That is not a crystal. Let's get into a little bit of the mathematics of what makes that repeating pattern, what makes something a crystal. So as I said before, a crystal will have translational symmetry, and for the rest of this lecture we're going to stick to 2 dimensions because it is much easier to visualize, not to mention that in this day and age there's a lot of study on materials that are inherently 2-dimensional, things like graphene or molybdenum sulfide. There are many examples that have now been found. Let's start with the definition of a lattice. A lattice in 2 dimensions is an infinite array of points, and the positions of those points can be generated by just 2 vectors. Here, the vectors A and B. So if we were to start with this point and say that's our starting point, and we wanted to generate all of the other points, we could do that simply by adding together linear combinations of the vectors A and B. For example, this lattice point here, which I have just chosen arbitrarily, we could get to that lattice point by adding together 2 of vector A and 3 of vector B. Okay? And we could do a different combination of lattice vectors to get any of the other points in the lattice. Now, once you have a lattice like this, the repeating unit, the brick from which you build the wall, is called the unit cell. And in 2 dimensions, that unit cell is always a kind of a parallelogram, where we're going to take the lattice vectors A and B, and we're going to form a parallelogram from those 2 vectors. And so that's shown here in gray. That's our repeating unit. Now, in 2 dimensions, there's only a finite number of lattices, and there's only a finite number of shapes that the unit cell can adopt. We could come at that number from a variety of different ways, but the way I want to do it here is to think about what shapes can be used to tile space. Here I've chosen 8 different 2-dimensional shapes, and what I would like you to do is to stop the video for a minute and think about, okay, can I fill in all space with these shapes? And I think you're going to see that you can with some of the shapes, but not with others. So why don't you stop the video and give that a try, and then we'll come back and go over the answer. Welcome back. What did you come up with? Well, you should have found that while you can tile space with many of the shapes, there are some shapes that will not tile space. We can easily tile space with a square or with a rectangle. That's very easy to see. The hexagon tiles all space. That's one you see a lot in daily life. Obviously, the parallelogram, which was the example on the previous slide, tiles all space. And we can also tile space with the rhombus. But we cannot tile space with some of the shapes, like octagons or pentagons. So let's take the pentagon, for example. Obviously, if you just take all the pentagons and you keep that one corner pointing up, there's no way you can get these all to fit together and cover all the space. Even if we were to, let's say, rotate the pentagons, we would find that, yeah, still, I can't fill in all of the space. And so it turns out that not only do pentagons not work, or octagons, or 10-sided polygons, or 12-sided polygons. In fact, the only shapes that can tile space we covered on the last slide. That also means that when we get to crystals and we look at their symmetry, we're only going to find the symmetry elements that are found in those kinds of shapes. For rotation axes, this is important. We're only going to find 2-fold, 3-fold, 4-fold, and 6-fold rotation axes in a crystal. Something like a 5-fold axis, which you might encounter in a molecule, we will not find in a crystal. So let's now think about what the unit cell would be for each of those polygons that tile space. We're going to put all of the polygons together, and then we're going to put a lattice point at the center of each polygon, and we'll come up with these lattices. So here you see the square lattice. Here you see the rectangular lattice and the oblique lattice. Right? So this comes from tiling squares, rectangles, and parallelograms. There are certain relationships between the lattice vectors. A square is a very specific kind of parallelogram, one where the sides, A and B, are equal, so our lattice vectors are equal, and the angle between them is 90. It's also true that if you have a square lattice, you have a fourfold rotation axis. So every crystal that has a square lattice will have, by definition, a fourfold rotation axis. If you have a rectangle, now A and B can be of different lengths, but the angle between them still must be 90. They are orthogonal to each other. And we'll see later that the requisite symmetry element of a rectangular lattice is a mirror plane, or something that we'll talk about in a couple of lectures, which is a glide plane. In an oblique lattice, it's not required that we have any symmetry, although in a two-dimensional oblique lattice we could have a twofold rotation axis, but that's not required. And then finally, the fourth lattice here, the hexagonal lattice, is a little bit different than the others in that the shape of the unit cell is not the same thing as the shape of the polygon that we tiled together. The unit cell cannot be a hexagon because a hexagon can't be defined with the parallelogram defined by two vectors. Instead, the unit cell is shown in blue here, and it is a very specific kind of parallelogram, one where A and B are equal to each other, and the angle between them is 120 degrees. Okay, so this kind of rhombus, if you want to call it that, but a very specific rhombus, that's the unit cell for a hexagonal lattice. In the hexagonal lattice, we must have either threefold or sixfold rotation axes. Now, the fifth kind of lattice is the rhombus, and here we show the array of points you might get from a rhombus. Here I put the unit cell at the corners, but I could move the rhombus up so that the lattice points are at the center of the rhombus. And that's a perfectly valid unit cell. But for every rhombus, we could also draw a unit cell that is a little more symmetric. And that is, we could draw a rectangle. And that rectangle would have a lattice point at its center. Okay, so this is an example of what we will call a centered unit cell. So for the lattice that we get from tiling rhombuses, which is called a centered rectangular lattice, we will oftentimes draw this centered unit cell with two lattice points, one at the corners and one at half of vector A and half of vector B, right here. But it is permissible, and in some cases we might choose to draw this smaller primitive unit cell, which has only one lattice point. So these are our 5 lattices. They're called Bravais lattices in 2 dimensions, and these are the only 5. Now you might say, well, if I could have a centered rectangular lattice, why couldn't I have a centered square lattice? We can obviously draw a square lattice, and then we could put a lattice point at the center of each unit cell, right, so that we'd have 2 lattice points per unit cell. This is a centered square unit cell. Now, why is this not valid? And the reason it's not valid, or not a unique lattice, is because we can draw another unit cell, shown here, which has only half the area and contains only 1 lattice point, and it is also a square, right? So we always want to draw the smallest possible unit cell, and if we can draw a smaller unit cell that is the same shape, we'll always choose to do that. All right, let's have you now do a couple of examples. I've got a couple patterns here of circles, or you could think of them as spheres, or even atoms if you like. And what I want you to do is to find the unit cell, draw the unit cell, and then determine what kind of lattice we have. And while you're at it, why don't you see how many atoms of A and B are in the unit cell, and that will give us the empirical formula. So pause the video for a minute, have a go at these problems, and then when you've got the answer, come back and we'll go over them. Welcome back. Let's now reveal the answers. Okay, in the top one, we have a unit cell that is a square. Now, if you didn't get that right away, a huge clue that the unit cell must be a square is it's not too hard to look at this array of circles and realize that there's a fourfold rotation axis right at the center of each circle. If I rotate by 90 degrees, I'm going to get the same pattern back. And if I have a fourfold rotation axis of symmetry, then the unit cell in 2 dimensions must be a square. This is the smallest square that we can draw, and you can see that it contains one atom of B, or one circle of B, or one sphere of B. And then, parts of 4 white circles are also in the square. And each of those, if I would take each of those wedges and add them together, it would come up to be also one atom. So there's one of A and one of B in the unit cell, and the empirical formula must be AB. That should make sense to you because when you look at this pattern, you can intuitively see that there are equal numbers of atoms A and B. In the lower example, now you might look at this and say, well, I can kind of see hexagons in the way these things are packed. But because the circles are different colors, white and black, there are no 6-fold axes. There are no 3-fold axes present here. This coloring into stripes of A and B means that we don't have those higher order rotation axes. But we do have a mirror plane. Right? Look, isn't there a mirror plane running down each stripe of white circles or black circles? And if we have a mirror plane, then the unit cell should be a rectangle, especially if we don't have a higher order rotation axis. And so this is the smallest rectangle that we can draw. And for the same reason I discussed in the upper pattern, there's one of atom A and one of atom B in the unit cell. So the empirical formula here is AB. Some of you might have drawn the conclusion that I have a centered rectangular cell. I mean, there is an atom that is on the edges and at the center, but those are not the same, right? On one of these I have a white atom, and at the other place I have a black atom. And one of the definitions of a lattice is that surroundings or the environment at each lattice point has to be identical. So this is a primitive rectangular lattice. Okay, a lattice in and of itself is not a crystal. What a lattice is we can think of it as a scaffold upon which we're going to build our crystal. And we build the crystal by associating an atom or a group of atoms with each lattice point. And from the definition of a lattice, that has to be the same at every lattice point. So let's do a couple of examples. In this one, we're going to start with a square lattice. And the atoms that we're going to associate with each lattice point, which we can call a basis or a motif, is going to be this CuO2 unit, copper and 2 oxygens, and there's going to be a 90-degree bond angle between the 2 oxygens. So we're going to put the copper on each lattice point, along with the oxygens. That's on lattice point 1. And now we have to do exactly the same thing at every other lattice point. And when we do that, you see we build up this infinite crystal, this infinite pattern of repeating atoms. Here I'm just showing a finite slice of it, obviously. Now, one of the things to realize is that, I've drawn a line between the copper and the oxygens to maybe signify a bond. But there's nothing that says that the atoms can only bond to the other atoms in the motif. If you look at this pattern for a minute, you'll see that each oxygen actually has 2 equally distant copper neighbors. Okay, one that's in the motif and another one in a neighboring motif. All right, and so we get this pattern of square planar copper and linear oxygen. All right, so this is how we take a square lattice and we make this crystal structure. If I were to take a different motif, I would get a different crystal structure. Let's do another example. Let's start now with a hexagonal lattice, and our basis or motif we're going to take as this 2 carbon atoms. Okay, and in this example, we are not going to put the atoms on the lattice point. We're going to associate this 2-atom motif with this lattice point, and the atoms are displaced by the vectors here from the lattice point. Before I go on with the video, why don't you fill out the rest of this lattice? Add up the carbon atoms that go with each lattice point, and then let's see what the crystal structure looks like. So pause the video, and when you're done, come back and I'll show you the answer. Okay, what did you get? Did you get something that looked familiar? Well, let's complete the example here, and I'll show you what I got. So here I'm adding in those 2 carbon atoms, exactly the same distance from each lattice point. And when I do that, I get this pattern. And this pattern should look familiar to you, because you can see that we've got a bunch of hexagons that are basically all interconnected. And this should look familiar because this is the structure of graphene, right? The 2-dimensional pattern of atoms that comes from graphite, 1 layer of graphite. Okay, and so we see in graphene that we have a hexagonal unit cell. It's a hexagonal lattice, but with 2 atoms, not just 1 per lattice point.